coming out this afternoon, and I'd like to thank the sponsors too. I could rename them, but thank you for making this happen. This is my first time visiting the city of Miami, so it's a pleasure to be here. All right, I want to start with a question that I asked my students in a seminar last fall about the meaning of medicine. We were discussing the concept of medicine and health in Africa. And after some back and forth, I asked them a seemingly simple question: what is medicine? Now that question launched the class into an unexpected debate and even more back and forth, until one of the students came up with a rather clever solution and said, why don't we identify the local words that African communities, the communities that we were studying themselves, used to describe medicine? And why don't we approach the idea of what medicine means to these communities based on those words, right? And this is where diversity in the classroom becomes important, because there were African students in that class. So they began to come up with and discuss the various local words for medicine in their languages, in their communities. Now, this exercise made one thing clear, that when we attempt to define medicine based on the local words for it, it opened up boundaries of what was considered healing and therapy in local African settings where they might be excluded in Western frameworks. Now, interpretations of African words for medicine, it became clear that it also included the physical, the natural, the spiritual, and the psychosocial. Now, I want you to imagine this picture. A woman in labor lies on a raffia mat in a small prayer house somewhere in 1930s Nigeria. Around her, women sing, pray, and recite passages from the book of Psalms. The leader, a prophet, healer, and midwife stand beside her, holding a Bible on one hand, a bowl of water on the other hand. There are no doctors, no sterile gloves, no stethoscopes, but there is order, care, and a deep unshaken belief. Now imagine how this scene would have appeared in the eyes of a colonial health officer during that time. Superstition, fanaticism, danger, native ignorance. But to the women present, it was something else entirely. It was a site of faith, community, and what they felt was control over life itself. So what I'm going to do today is to discuss how exactly such a system that I've invoked through this picture that I created, emerged in Nigeria, beginning in the late 1920s, and how this system of faith healing pushed colonial and post-colonial boundaries of what could be recognized and viewed as medicine and primary health care. Now, in 1920s Nigeria, the boundaries of what qualified as healing, as therapy, as medicine, began to shift at the time of a serious public health crisis, the influenza pandemic of 1918. And this is where my narrative of faith-based delivery homes begin. Now, the pandemic, the influenza pandemic began in the spring of 1918 on the heels of the First World War, towards the end of the First World War. And that pandemic spread across the world following the movement of soldiers returning to their homes, returning to different fronts, and personnel also returning to their various locations. Now, at the same time that this disease spread, one of the ways that the British colonial government dealt with it was by quarantine measures, shutting down congregations, community spaces, spaces of public gatherings, including churches and mosques. Now, these closures were happening at the same time that the biomedical infrastructure in the areas were inadequate, physically inadequate, but also unable to deal with the pandemic. A lot of the therapies that were available, medicines that were available, were unresponsive, did not work to curb the pandemic. Now, this is a quote from 1932 that I have on the screen, describing the extent of the health personnel when it comes to biomedical health personnel in the area, some of the areas that I had on the map in the previous slide. This quote is from 1932, and you can see what it says. That in an area as large as England and Wales, there were no mission doctors and 4 or 5 government doctors whose efforts were dedicated to government officials and civil servants. So imagine what the picture would have looked like in 1918. It would have been even worse, right? And now the other quote here shows that by December 1918, this quote is from a medical report of the southern provinces. And by December 1918, the government had basically thrown in the towel. The colonial government was of the opinion that matters had necessarily been left to themselves. And left to themselves they were. People began to form prayer bands. People turned to the spiritual to deal with the pandemic. It created an environment rife with prophetic movements, apocalyptic teachings, and there were prophecies earlier on before the pandemic that something like this was going to happen. So people began to congregate, and traditional medicine wasn't much help either. People began to rely on prophecies, on faith healing, on revelations for guidance and to deal with the pandemic. Now, as a result of this, quite a number of prayer houses, prayer groups that eventually culminated into African independent churches, what we call independent African churches, with their own theologies emerged. But these churches did not turn into a large-scale African independent church movement or prayer movement until 1929, when Joseph Babalola, the man on the screen, shows up. In 1928, Babalola was working for the government as a driver in the Department of Public Works. And he was the son of a Church Missionary Society church teacher. He had some education. But around this time, he believed that he has a calling to become an evangelist, to begin to preach, and to begin to pray for healing. And he begins this mission. Now, Babalola performed a number of miracles that were quite public, including cases that were popular in his community, in the communities where those cases existed. So his prayers and the impact of it became very public, and so it drew a lot of attention. It drew crowds to him, not only from Yoruba land, the parts that, not only from this area right here, but also outside of the area. He drew a crowd to the extent that even the government noticed. And one of his teachings, some of his teachings was based on a belief on faith healing, absolute reliance on God for healing. And part of his argument was that biomedicine had proven that it didn't work, that it failed. Because it wasn't just influenza, 1918, 1919. It was also the bubonic plague, several outbreaks of the bubonic plague throughout the 1920s, including when the pandemic was also going on. There were outbreaks of smallpox. So people were dealing with several diseases that hospitals and the biomedical sciences could not deal with and could not respond to. So his preaching, his message was that there had to be a total reliance on God, on faith healing, on prayers, on the scriptures for healing. And of course, he condemned idolatry, a recourse to traditional medicine. That was a sin. That was a no-no. Now, I'm going to keep talking about this slide, but in the Q&A, we can talk about missionary and colonial government responses to the movement that Babalola triggered. But I start chapter 3 of my book with a description by a district officer, a colonial officer, who actually went to one of Babalola's revival services. He says he went in there under this guise as a local. He wanted to see what was actually going on in this gathering because a lot of people were trooping in. There were traffic all over the place. in Oyo province because people were trooping into the area just to attend one of his revival services. And now, one of the things that the district officer observed was that attendants were mostly women. I actually pulled the title of this chapter directly from his quote. He wrote, "Attendants, mostly women." Now, there were proof, of course, we have established proof from the records that this movement appealed to men as much as it did women, because colonial records observed that the movement attracted the clerk type. It wasn't just the lower class or ordinary people, people without any education. It actually, what they meant by a clerk type were government workers, cop clerks, policemen. They actually named them policemen, members of the native administration, including local chiefs. So this movement was sweeping and widespread in the nature of what it captured. But as of 1932, the moment when the district officer recorded these statistics, the numbers, as you can see here, I'm not sure how he got those numbers, but the Aladura have been known for their record keeping anyway. But the numbers were overwhelmingly female. 7,656 converts in 1932, and a little over 6,000 were women. Now, there were various reasons for that. One of those reasons was the predominance of fertility-related issues in that particular area at the time that Babalola emerged. Throughout the 1920s, the colonial medical reports were discussing the issue of gonorrhea and syphilis, how this was sabotaging the population in this area, the fertility rate in this part of Nigeria. And government was concerned, was alarmed at the extent of the decline for their own reasons, mostly protection of their, what they termed their future labor supply. For the women in this area, they were concerned for their own reasons as well. First of all, this is an agrarian society where the size of a man and a woman's family was important and actually equated to your standing in the society. But for the women, the lack of children in a marriage actually jeopardized their position in their husbands' homes. So this was an important issue that they needed to deal with. And for a man with a proven track record of miracles, people who were truly very popular, was related to a pregnancy, a pregnant woman whose labor was overdue, whose delivery was long overdue, not overdue by a few months, long overdue. And he prayed for this woman when he visited her community, and she immediately went into labor. And people began to troop even more to see him, women even more so. Now, of course, because of the nature of the issues that were being presented before Babalola, I think you can see in this quote. This quote is from Church Missionary Society priest, who points out that a lot of the things that he paid attention to prenatal and postnatal care. So his movement began to tilt to catering to women and catering to women's reproductive needs. Now, at first, the way that he structured that care was more ad hoc. Women who needed care, women who needed to give birth, because again, he preached absolute reliance on faith healing for true believers. So those women who actually conceived after visiting his meeting, or whose pregnancies were due, returned to the revival locations, returned to the various congregations. At this point, Babalola was affiliated with Faith Tabernacle, which was one of the churches that emerged from the earlier prophetic movement that I talked about in 1918. He becomes affiliated with them around this time, in 1932 actually. This church explodes, becomes very popular. Women begin to return to those congregations to have their babies. And those who provided care for these women included the wives of ministers, older women who had experience with childbirth, women who were already midwives, pastors' wives, evangelists, female evangelists, or the wives of evangelists themselves. They all provided care. And then there were praying bands too. whose job it was to pray and to fast and to make sure that any spiritual issue that was going to interfere with safe delivery was dealt with spiritually. Now, from the records in this book, Thoughts of an Apostle, this was actually a collection of Babalola's writings, teachings, and letters that was translated and published in 2000. From the records in this book, we see that by the late 1930s, Babalola actually begins to think carefully about the ways that he's structuring childbirth, the care of pregnant women. And his practice was basically based on prayers, psalms, nutrition, hygiene, exercise, and even birthing positions. He had clear instructions on what a pregnant woman should be eating. And he promoted the ingestion of fruits and vegetables for a healthy pregnancy. And he thought about the importance of exercise, some kind of movement, all the way to delivery, to, again, keep a healthy pregnancy. Now, he had an interesting teaching about birthing position, too. He thought that the lithotomy position that we're probably most familiar with, the position in the hospitals where you lie flat on your back to deliver a baby, his teaching was that that was actually dangerous for a woman having babies. And from his records, from his letters, I don't get a sense of his rationale, right, for that one. But he also condemns upright position, birthing in an upright position. And my inference is that he was concerned that a baby might fall and hit the ground and then be injured. What he promoted was a sitting position or a kneeling position. That was what he thought was the best way to have babies. And these positions were not new or alien. These were positions that already existed in these communities. And then hygiene. He had a detailed instruction on hygiene, the importance of personal hygiene, but also hygiene in the environment in general to have a safe delivery. So at this point, it became not just about prayers and not just about the recitation of psalms and the use of blessed water, but also practical things that could curb what he considered maternal deaths. And part of his rationale too was to curb maternal deaths. And you have to again think about his rationale too was to curb maternal deaths. And you have to again think about the time that we're talking about and the fact that biomedical hospitals, maternities were scarce, few and far between. And based on the interviews that I had, even up to 1949, up to 1950s, these were few and far between. And he famously argued that a dirty kitchen is the forerunner of death. Now, during this period, there was no official mandate that prevented members of Babalola's congregation or the people who followed him as part of the Aladura movement that barred them from using hospitals until 1946, actually. Now, Babalola, I mentioned earlier that he became a part of Faith Tabernacle. In 1939, there's a rift in Faith Tabernacle, and Babalola and his followers formed the Christ Apostolic Church. Now, this rift was based on a group of the church believing in absolute reliance on faith healing, and the other group believing in the syncretic use of faith healing, but also hospitals. And of course, as you can guess, Babalola headed the group that believed in absolute reliance on faith healing. And so they formed their own church, Christ Apostolic Church. Now, in 1946, the church constitution created its first constitution. And one of the things that they put in there was an outright ban on their female members birthing in the hospital. Now, this becomes a turning point for the church because now they begin to encounter different things that force them to begin to think about a structure. And of course, at this point, the colonial government is like, well, we're done with these people. Begins to frustrate them. Had various examples of things that they were doing to thwart that reliance on faith healing. Because again, although these people, the Aladura people were outside of the missionary control, colonial control, because they begin to build their own schools, to begin to create their own stories, their own structures, where they do things their own way. A lot of their members were, again, government workers. They were clerks. They were people that still had to intersect with the government. Now, in addition to government opposition, there was also pressure internally to create a more permanent structure when it comes to women's delivery. And that pressure came from CAC women themselves. In the same year that the Constitution came out, they created an association, the Good Women Association. Now, although there was a ban on using medicine, there was not a ban on working in the biomedical field. So its CAC members could actually be nurses, trained as nurses, as midwives, even as doctors. And this approach was tactical, because if there was a ban on them participating in these fields, my guess is that there would have been a further rift, because this church membership wasn't just from a particular class, it was from the working class. And in this period, in the 1940s, the colonial government had largely ignored women's health. But in the 1940s, they were paying attention for various reasons that I will not get into. And they were beginning to expand maternity services, build maternity centers. But where are the women that will work in those centers? Because women's education was largely ignored up to this point. Now the government is ramping up and creating these opportunities for Nigerian women to begin to train as midwives. And this was an opportunity for CAC women too. A lot of them went into the field of nursing and midwifery, because this was one of the few fields that was open to them. And the two pictures on the screen are pictures of some of the popular characters, female characters in CAC. This one is a woman, Mama Ogunrati, she's called, who created many CAC, more than 15 CAC churches in Nigeria and outside Nigeria. She was a nurse. She actually enrolled in the University College Ibadan in 49, which was at the time affiliated with London, and had her training in nursing. This woman here was an evangelist in the CAC, also a trained nurse. She eventually left CAC, created her own church, and built her own maternity home as well. Now, as a result of all of this pressure that was coming not just from internally, but also from the government, one of the moves that Babalola decides to make with the support of CAC Good Women was to build a faith home, to build an actual institution dedicated to the care of pregnant women. Now, previously, faith homes were just spaces where sick people, needy people, people with all kinds of problems could congregate and get attention, spiritual attention to their issues. But in 58 and 59, what changed was that the faith home became an institution, specifically an institution dedicated to the care of pregnant women. Now, one of the things that they did here too, in 59, when the first faith home initially opened in a rental apartment in 58, was moved to a permanent location, the location that you see here. I have other pictures of it, but this is one of the buildings that CAC Good Women actually built. When it moved to this location, Babalola and the Good Women Association built a faith home midwifery training school. So they built a training school, and I'm going to talk about the shifts that happened at this moment, because from this time, the faith home's identity went from the informal realm of health seeking in a religious setting to that of a professional institution with its own sets of laws, codified practices, and as we will see, trained experts. Now, 1959 and the post-1960s, post-independence era, were pivotal moments for CAC's faith delivery home structures as they began to negotiate new forms of recognition. What followed on the part of faith homes was not simply accommodation. but a recasting of medical authority, where spiritual legitimacy met bureaucratic legitimacy. African actors were reshaping the very meanings of what counted as medicine or medical therapy, and women as practitioners and as patients forged a hybrid modernity that did not reject science, but integrated it on their own terms. Now I'm going to talk about some of these shifts. The first one was in the leadership of the Faith Home and the training center, the training school that Babalola built. Now Babalola passes away in July of 1959, on the very night that he commissions that Faith Home. That commissioning was his last act, and he passed away in his sleep there on that site. But one of the moves that he made in response to criticism by the government, and this is something that we see over the course of his career, where he takes these criticisms from the government and he actually evolves. He rebuilds the system to kind of conform, to exist, to be able to exist in those spaces. He approached a member of CAC who had training in nursing and midwifery, both in London and Nigeria, to become the head of the Faith Home, to run this whole machine. And even after he died, up to date, the matrons that run the Faith Homes, the Midwifery Training Center, have training in midwifery, professional training in nursing and midwifery. So this was one of the moves that they made. And then let's look at the training program itself. The training program for the midwifery school was modeled after that of the colonial government, grade 2 midwifery. There were grade 1 midwives, grade 2 midwives, and this system was retained shortly after Nigerian independence. And what he did, and what CAC Good Women, including the matron, did, was to model that training after the grade 2, the lower tier midwives. Training lasted for 6 months, and because of low enrollment when it first started, training was one-on-one in person. But as membership expanded, enrollment in these trainings expanded, training became 1 year. And with that 1 year, there was a more uniform curriculum where there was screening. You apply, you'd be screened on the spiritual side, on the physical side, and then you enroll to become a midwife in this space. And as these spaces, now the pictures that I have on the screen were taken in 1920, but it's a good reflection of what the curriculum looks like even earlier on. They were giving people instructions, inviting their own members who had become academics and who were also nurses and health workers to come and provide lectures in these spaces. They were providing lectures in basic anatomy. They were providing lectures in basic biology, in homiletics, the art of actually preaching, the art of speaking and preaching. They built a women's theology school right there in that space so that these women would get grounding on hygiene, on nutrition, but also on the spiritual component that was so important to their instructions. Now, in the 1980s, first of all, as this training expanded to 2 years in 1980s, one of the things that began to happen too was CAC was becoming popular, having their locations in various parts of Nigeria, various parts of West Africa. So one of the things that the church then mandated was that every medium to large size CAC congregation had to have a faith home. So if you visited a medium-sized congregation, there's a faith home right next door, where members of the church could come and deliver their babies, and members of the public, including non-Christians, Muslims, were and still are having their babies in those spaces as well. So it was open to the public and it was free. That was a service that they provided to their communities. And then for those that trained in the faith home, at the end of their 2-year training, they also built a dormitory. So if you were training to become a midwife, a faith home midwife, you had to live in that hostel. You had to exist in that space and get this spiritual and physical training. And then at the end of that, they were posted more like a residency, where for 2 weeks they practiced under the watchful eyes of other people. The matron, other midwives, but also other health professionals within the CAC congregation. And if you passed, then you were posted to one of those faith homes. that had been built that are now part of the church. And the church can also elect to send somebody to go train. And at the end of their training, they returned to serve the church. So this was some of the system that they built up, that they created. 83 and 1985. The church introduced refresher courses and referral systems. Once the training became 2 years, there was now a mandatory refresher courses, an annual refresher course. That meant that every single midwife that was trained in the Faith Home Midwifery School that worked for CAC had to come back around April every year to this revival. This was a picture taken in 2016, and this is an actual revival ground. The people you see in uniforms are some of those Faith Home midwives. They congregate every April to have refresher courses. And at this point, they also begin to build alliances with the government health departments, and with the biomedical health workers as well, who they then began to invite to observe the workshops that they were doing in the refresher courses, and invited to give the lectures themselves. So this became an opportunity to kind of network, recharge spiritually, but also to connect on some of the current happenings in the field. Because during this period in the 80s, there was increased scrutiny on traditional midwives, traditional birth attendants, and on faith home midwives as well. This was a period of safe motherhood, the era of safe motherhood, where there was this global conversation and attention on maternal deaths. And part of the narrative that existed in that space was that part of the trouble was traditional midwives and faith home midwives. And so this institution was beginning to respond to that, to kind of distinguish themselves and say, well, we are taking every precaution. We are not part of the problem. Now, in the same period, they created a referral system. And this was after some backlash from doctors, from hospitals, that although these midwives were highly trained, because again, a lot of them who trained in the Faith Home Midwifery School actually had training too in the biomedical setting as nurses and as midwives. But then to operate in this space of faith healing, they also enrolled and got their 2-year training here as well. So doctors were acknowledging that although these midwives were highly trained, they were unwilling or unable to refer critical cases to the hospital in time, and that was a problem. So the attitude and the response of the Faith Home administration was, well, we do not want people to die in our faith homes and tarnish our image. We do not want to be associated with that and the bullying that comes with that. So what they did was establish a referral system, which was mandatory, where every faith home would have to identify a friendly hospital, because again, not everybody is open to the idea of faith healing, would identify a friendly hospital nearby that they work with, that they coordinate with, so that in the case of emergencies, these patients would immediately be transferred, be taken to the hospital. And it wasn't just like a referral, well, you have to go to the hospital now. Every faith home had a midwife and had 1 or 2 assistants. So when there's an emergency or something, they see an emergency coming, what they do is, unless the family or the woman herself objects, they would take this individual and practically escort her to the hospital. And as soon as the midwife or the midwife's assistant shows up, and the hospital identifies them as, okay, this is our partner down the road, they immediately take the woman and tend to her. Otherwise, what would happen is that the hospital could say, well, you did not register with us. We don't know you. We're not gonna go elsewhere. So this was how the system worked. And I actually witnessed this thing work in a 2019 interview. I had finished interviewing this female church leader who was also the midwife in the faith home associated with one of the large churches. After the interview, a woman walks in and she checks the woman's blood pressure, just off the cuff, check her blood pressure, and the blood pressure was very high. And she immediately said, you need to get to the hospital now. And she was in her 9th month of pregnancy too. So the assistant immediately escorted her and they went to the hospital. And the woman was then explaining to me afterwards that the day before, which was their mandatory prenatal care period, that this woman's blood pressure was also high, reading very high. And it didn't help that she was involved in an altercation with another woman. Like, why would you do that when you're already due for labor? So she immediately dispatched her to the hospital. That's a look, an idea of what that system looked like. Because they were required to attend mandatory faith clinic services every week. In fact, you had to do that beginning 5 months of pregnancy, or they may not take you in if you decided that you want to have a baby there. Because the logic is that they don't know what all you're coming in with, what's surrounding you on the spiritual side. And if they haven't had enough time to deal with that, you could have issues during delivery, and then it will be on them. So you had to start attending those meetings as early as 3 months or as early as possible, but definitely from 5 months. And they were also required to attend once every 2 weeks, depending on the clinic, prenatal services. And they were big on record keeping, and that's why I have this slide up here. They were very big on the kinds of records that they took. You can see that they even recorded the time when a woman got into one stage of labor and transitioned to the next stage of labor. And they recorded how many meetings that the woman had attended. And this record keeping was important for the referral system, because then they could just transfer these records to the hospital if a complication looks like it's coming up or did materialize after all. But it was also important for the annual reports that every faith home had to send to the faith home headquarters every time. I think it's a monthly thing. But every year, annually, the faith home headquarters released an annual report that included what was going on in here and how many babies were delivered in the faith homes. And it was a lot of babies. Now, I want to talk about the 1990s. The 1990s was a pivotal moment, another moment of transition and of evolution for these faith homes. Because during this period, well, biomedicine wasn't what it was in the 1920s or 1930s. It had come a long way. There were more hospitals than there were earlier on, even in the 1950s. There were more hospitals now. And these hospitals were beginning to complain that the faith home, especially the faith home headquarters that existed in a particular location, was beginning to take patients away from the hospital. Because now one of the dynamics that emerged was that patients were no longer going to the hospitals. They were beginning to go to the faith homes. And one of the matrons reported in an interview that in 1994, there was a meeting with some local doctors. And in that meeting, they were asking her to begin to send the patients, the pregnant women, to the hospital. And her argument was that, well, we provide the services that any other primary maternal health care provides. And we do that, we follow protocols. So why should we send our patients away and send them to you? Now, one of the strategic moves that they made, I had this picture up. Well, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. One of the strategic moves that they made was to create the position of a doctor in charge in 1996. This doctor was not necessarily domiciled in the faith home, but became part of the faith home governing board. This doctor was a part of creating the curriculum that the midwifery school ran was on the advisory board, provided advice when needed, and could actually intervene in the faith home too, if necessary and if they had time. Now, according to the matron, part of the reason they did that was to be able to position themselves to make exactly that, the arguments that she made earlier, that they followed the necessary protocols and that they should provide the services that they were providing. Now, during this period as well, there was this revision of the attitude towards medical sciences and towards biomedical technology. Because again, by the 1990s, this is a church that has always been appealing to the working class. By the 1990s, their youth are educated. They have a lot of doctors in their church membership. They have people working in government circles, people that needed to provide a certificate, a document that they went to a hospital clinic to be able to get their maternity leave approved, right? So there were all of these dynamics in the mix, and they began to shift their attitude. And one of the arguments that they made was that Joseph Babalola, the founder of CAC, did not necessarily condemn the use of biomedicine. And in fact, that argument was actually right. That the reason that he condemned the use of medicine at all in any form was that at the time, biomedicine was pretty much ineffective against a lot of the diseases that they were dealing with. And that if they allowed the church membership to use it then, that it exposes them to going back to idolatry, basically to backsliding. Because then if the medicine doesn't work, they're off to the traditional doctor and to the African priests looking for solutions. But that the circumstances have changed now. So immediately they began to popularize the acceptance of the use of things like blood pressure machines, as you noted in one of my examples, stethoscopes, HIV test strips, glucose strips, urinalysis test strips, like the one that this midwife is holding in this picture. And they also began to require certain tests that had to be conducted outside of the faith homes. And they monitored these tests judiciously in the cards that I showed you earlier. And this is one example of the test that this midwife showed me too. People had to check their HIV status, rhesus factor, blood type. They had to know all that and bring all that information before they begin attendance or before their due dates approach. Now, they also began to see that was authorized by the government to provide maternity services. In 2002, or around 2002, the Faith Home in Ede actually registers with the state where it existed, with the state's Ministry of Health, and became recognized as a primary healthcare provider, providing maternity health services to that community. Now, the problem was that the midwives who trained under the Faith Home Training Center were not necessarily covered by that certificate. So they were getting arrested, harassed, bullied in their various states in some cases where they practiced, because these documents, the one at the top, only applied to a particular state. So the move that they made was to gain federal recognition that would cover all of the faith homes that they had across the country. And they finally got that recognition through this certificate of incorporation in 2015. To get this approval, the Attorney General and the particular group, which means the Federal Ministry of Health, had to be involved. You have to meet certain requirements before this approval is given. And they finally achieved it in 2015. And as you can see in this Facebook post, that was a big deal. And they stated now the era of when our faith homes across the country were being harassed and labeled as illegal maternities is over. Hallelujah. So this was the ultimate form of evolution. So what does all of this story mean? You know, what does it mean to recast authority? It means a recognition that medicine has always been more than science. It is culture, it is politics, it is power. It means recognizing that African healers, doctors, midwives, and other practitioners were not merely obstacles to progress, but architects of new medical futures. Childbirth, once a site of colonial anxiety, and I did not get into details of that, became a space of African resilience and reinvention. And that, I think, is the story of African medicine. Not one of replacement, but of recasting, where faith, healing, and birth come together to redefine what it means to care, to cure, and to be recognized. And if you notice throughout my presentation, I keep saying CAC Faith Homes. That is because this kind of evolution, this kind of navigation did not apply to other faith homes and to other churches that emerged as part of the earlier faith healing movement, but also the movement in the 1930s. But this particular church was very deliberate in the way that it navigated these spaces, in the ways that it combined the spiritual, and it still held, despite all of these changes, it still held the core of its belief, faith healing. They believed in prayers, and people actually went to them and continue to go to them for issues that they believe have defied medical authority, issues that no longer could be handled by medicine were usually taken to these spaces as well. Now, I'd like to invite us to think about one of the questions that I have highlighted at the beginning. What is medicine? Considering everything that we've just heard, let us imagine what that answer would be if we centered the communities of care, the women who seek care, the communities that enable them, when we think about what medicine means to various audiences. Perhaps what we might come up with when we look at history and our historical narratives here in the US, on the African continent, elsewhere in the world, would include maternal health innovations that blend tradition, community care, and technology, especially against the backdrop of biomedical and economic scarcity. And on that note, I will end, and we will continue the conversation in the Q&A. Thank you for
listening. Wonderful, wonderful. Can we give Dr. Williams another round?